I'm just going to throw this question out there. I'm just going to throw it out there. What does right wing mean? Anybody? Anybody in the chat want to answer that? What does right wing mean? Give me the definition of the term right wing. Better yet, give me the definition of the term left wing. What does left wing mean? I thought that would be the theme of my opening remarks tonight because, it's interesting. I think that Zohran Mamdani is the best candidate for mayor of New York, and he is the left-wing candidate. And I think he's the best guy out of all of them. I don't think he's perfect, and I certainly, there are things about his past and all that, but overall, he is critical of Israel. He is wanting to provide grocery stores across the city. He's wanting to freeze the rent on half the apartments. He wants free buses. Of all the major candidates for mayor of New York City, I think the left-wing guy is the better one. But that said, is the left-wing guy always the better one? No. And what makes him left-wing? Kim Iverson, who I greatly respect, been on her show many times, she said that Zohran Mamdani is the MAGA candidate of New York City. Right? That even though he's not born in the United States, even though he's a Muslim, even though he's a socialist, he's the MAGA candidate. Because he says he would put New York City first, not Israel. Right? That he's the MAGA candidate. And there are actually other people in the MAGA camp who agree there's a rising movement of people that are MAGA for Zohran Mamdani. Well, MAGA is right wing. Or is it? What does right wing mean? What does left wing mean? What do these words mean? Right? Hempcar says, I thought right wing meant originally that you side with the rich more whether you're rich, poor, or rich. I don't know about that. Right? I mean, you watch Fox News, they rant against those yuppies and limousine liberals and trust fund kids, and there's a lot of very, very poor people in Appalachia, in the South, that are quote unquote right wing. The majority of fundamentalist Christians are very low income, and that's considered one of the major right wing movements in America. Evangelical and fundamentalist Christians tend to be very low income, and on social issues, working people tend to be more quote unquote right wing. More working people oppose abortion. More working people are opposed to homosexuality. It tends to be wealthier people that are more open-minded about those kind of things, don't have an issue with them. I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, the origin of the term is that in France, they had a revolution. The king was forced to step down, and a national assembly was created. And the people who sat on the right were the people that were still loyal to the king, and the people who sat on the left were the Jacobins, the more radical people who fully embraced the ideals of the French Revolution. But what are the ideals of the French Revolution? Liberty, égalité, fraternity. Well, I know a lot of right-wing people that would say that they agree with all of those things. They're for freedom, free markets, government don't leave you alone, get the government off our backs. That's liberty. Égalité, right? Equal rights for everybody. Fraternity, brotherhood among the nation, loyalty. Those sound like they could be right-wing values. They could be left-wing values too. Left-wing people are for freedom. They're for egalitarianism, equality. They're for, brotherhood of mankind, right? So what does left-wing mean? What does right-wing mean? It's a fair question. It's a fair question. And in this instance, in New York City, I am telling you, I think the left-wing guy, the farthest left-wing, I guess, candidate for mayor we've had in quite some time, I think he's the best man for the job. But I don't always think that. In the last election, I thought Trump was the better of the two major candidates. He certainly disappointed me. I was hoping that he meant what he said about ending the wars and protecting our freedoms. Doesn't seem that he actually meant it. And he's bombed Iran, which is the exact opposite of what he said he would do. He said he wouldn't get us into any new wars. And he has targeted Palestine students and deported them for their political views. And, Trump has disappointed me in a lot of ways. But, I didn't think that, Trump would necessarily do what he said. But if Kamala Harris had won, that would have been people voting to continue the war in Ukraine. That would have been people voting for more wars and foreign interventions. That would have been a vote in favor of the FBI. And even though Trump hasn't delivered, it's better that people voted for the guy who wanted to stop the FBI, at least said he did. It's better people voted for the guy who said he wanted to stop wars. I guess Trump was the right-wing candidate in the election. And he's certainly, has disappointed me if ever. There are a few good things he's done that I appreciated, but, I especially when it comes to foreign policy and civil liberties, he's disappointed me. I appreciated the memorandum regarding the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is unconstitutional, should be overturned. But largely, the way that they've gone after dissident students, the way ICE is violating due process, I'm not thrilled about. But, one thing that separates the Center for Political Innovation, my organization, from every other group that that comes out of socialism or anti-imperialism, we don't even use those labels anymore because they confuse people. One thing that really defines us is that there's this understanding. If you're an anti-imperialist, if you're an advocate of socialism, there's this understanding that you're supposed to think that there's this big, scary, evil thing called the right wing. And no matter how bad the Democrats might be, no matter how much, the liberals sell you out, no matter what the situation, the worst thing is always the right wing. Right? It is this big, scary monster, the right wing. And you're supposed to be terrified of the right wing. And even if you don't vote for the Democrats, you still have to focus on fighting the right wing. And no one can tell me what this right wing is. Okay? Now, when I first entered politics, the president was George W. Bush. And he was a Republican, and he did all kinds of things I vehemently disagreed with. He invaded Iraq. He instituted the Patriot Act. He instituted all kinds of neoliberal free market economic policies that gutted the country. And when I was coming up, being right wing meant you liked George W. Bush. And people who didn't like George W. Bush were considered to be left wing. And Fox News was in its neocon days. This was the days of Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity. Right? Two right-wing Irishmen, two conservative Irishmen who blasted the airwaves, right? You had Bill O'Reilly and Sean O'Hannity, and the two Irishmen that dominated the airwaves and were, if you disagreed with Bush, you were a traitor, you needed to move to another country, and they were always talking about the far left, the far left, the far left. And I think someone once asked one of them, they said, is there such thing as a moderate left? No, it's the far left, the far left, the far left. And it was always, everyone that was opposing Bush was the far left, and they were bad. And I was involved in the Iraq War protests back in the day. And the Iraq War protests, they were largely led by communist groups. The main three anti-war coalitions were, the big one was called United for Peace and Justice, and it was quietly run by the Democratic Socialists of America and the Committees of Correspondence and the Communist Party USA. The main leader was Judith LeBlanc, who was a member of the Communist Party USA. The communists are left-wing. But the Libertarian Party participated in the demonstrations. Alex Jones, before anyone even knew who Alex Jones was, he was walking around the rallies with his microphones. Why do we got to fight George W. Bush? He's taking our freedoms away. Why? Because he's a Trotskyite. The neocons are all Trotskyite communists. And we need real capitalism back. We got to get back to 1776. Was he right-wing? I mean, back then he was considered left-wing because he was against the U.S. invasion of Iraq. He was against the Patriot Act, and he was at the same anti-war protests I was at. I saw Alex Jones, who was quite unheard of back then, walking around. 9/11 was an inside job by the Illuminati, right? And he was considered left-wing. And the LaRouche movement, I remember they would set up at the anti-war protests. They'd have their choirs that were singing, and they were part of the anti-war protest movement. But all the communists would say, the LaRouche movement, they're right-wing, they shouldn't be here. And I'd be like, okay, why are they right-wing? And I read their literature, and it was kind of hard to make clear what they were really for. But they were against Bush. They had a book called Children of Satan that was about George W. Bush and the neocons. They were the children of Satan, and they had Dick Cheney on the cover with like devil horns on his head. That sounds pretty left-wing. I mean, what does left-wing and right-wing mean? At this point, it doesn't mean anything. I'll just be honest with you. At this point, it doesn't mean anything. During the Cold War, left-wing and right-wing were easy to define because there was this giant anchor that everything was defined in relation to. And that was called communism. It's because of the Soviet Union, the global communist movement. The Soviet Union and the political parties around the world that were aligned with the Soviet Union, that were the communist parties, the closer you were to them, the more left-wing you were. Communism was by definition left-wing. And if you were some variant of the communist ideology, maybe you were a Trotskyite, maybe you were an anarchist, maybe you were a Maoist, maybe you were or if you were some like more mild version of it, you were a social democrat, or if you were a liberal who wanted to negotiate with them and thought that people should be allowed to openly advocate communism even though you didn't agree with it, but you wanted to protect their civil liberties, you didn't want to go to war in Vietnam, to have the closer you were to communism, the more left-wing you were, and the further away from communism you were, the more right-wing you were. But being further away from communism did not necessarily mean loving capitalism. And this is where I get frustrated with American conservatives. I really do, right? American conservatives have no clue that there's ever been a such thing as right-wing anti-capitalism. Dinesh D'Souza, who's a Fox News writer, he wrote a whole book saying, the Democrats are Marxists, and that's why they were racist during Jim Crow, because Hitler is a National Socialist and Hitler was a Marxist. It's like Hitler called himself right-wing. Hitler hated Marxism. Hitler was a right-wing anti-capitalist. Right? And I mean, right-wing anti-capitalism exists all over the world. What you might call right-wing or conservative anti-capitalism predates Marxism by hundreds and hundreds of years. Why do you think they used to call money filthy lucre? It was a sin to touch money. The Catholic Church said you couldn't touch money. In fact, Jews, that was the reason that they were separate, is that they were the people that were allowed to touch money. It was a sin for anyone living in a Catholic country in the Middle Ages to touch currency. They couldn't touch it. And touching money, having money, spending money, and eventually, lending money at interest, that was something that only Jews could do because it was a sin. And the Catholic Church condemns capitalism. There's probably people that say, Caleb, that's crazy. No, look it up. The Catholic Church opposes both capitalism and Marxism. They say Marxism is godless. Marxism is economic determinist and doesn't allow people to have moral agency. But they also say that capitalism is godless, puts money above morality. And the Catholic Church opposes both capitalism and Marxism. There you go. And, the Catholic Church, they were against capitalism as capitalism was coming into existence. And fascists, until the 1950s, the people that we call far right, right? That if you call someone far right, you're generally calling them a Nazi, a fascist, a white supremacist. Until the 1950s in America, and still in most of the world, people that are in far right groups tend to condemn capitalism. In America, one of the big far right preachers, was the radio priest Father Coughlin, who was in in Michigan. And Father Coughlin would condemn capitalism in his broadcasts, but he was really against the communists, right? His broadcasts would start out, he would talk about money comes before everything, and that's a problem. In America, we've forgotten God, and we put money. Capitalism is a violation of our freedom. He would talk that way. And then he would start talking about how ruthless the communists are because they don't believe in God. And then he would blame communism on the Jews. But it began with condemnation of capitalism. I mean, there you go back before World War I, even Oswald Spengler, the guy who wrote The Decline of the West. Oswald Spengler, the German traditionalist, he condemned capitalism. And he argued that within the human spirit, there are two natural drives. One is individualism, self-gain, and he called that capitalism. And then he said that there's also loyalty and community and hierarchy. And he argued that was socialism. And in addition to Oswald Spengler, you had what they called Prussian socialism, Ernst Juncker, right? And you had a bunch of weird militaristic German nationalists who were in favor of what they called socialism, but it was not leftist socialism. It was a military, authoritarian, imperialistic, non-capitalist society where the state, controlled the economy to ensure order. But in America, we don't know that, right? And it's actually very common among, if you watch conservative propaganda, that conservatives consider any criticism of capitalism to be de facto communist. And that's not necessarily true. It wasn't really until the 1950s that this kind of became a big part of discourse, that any criticism of capitalism was equated with communism. And that was because during World War II, most of the world was destroyed. Almost every major city in the world was, in the Western world at least, was destroyed. Japan, a major industrial country, was just completely destroyed. The Korean Peninsula was completely destroyed. Every major city in Europe was destroyed. And as a result, you had the post-World War II economic expansion. And the economy in the world was the best it had ever been. There has never been more economic growth than there was from 1946 to 1973. The post-World War II economic expansion was the greatest period of economic growth in human history, not just in the West, but all over the world. In America, that was the heyday, the 1950s, the house, the car, the white picket fence. In Europe, that was the heyday of social democracy and the welfare state. That's when they created a national health service in Britain. That's when the French government created full employment by just hiring anyone who lost their job and paying them to paint pictures, or whatever. But in the developing world, that was the heyday of communism. Communism rapidly expanded. All of Eastern Europe was pretty much, aligned with the Soviet Union. The Chinese Communist Revolution happened, and the sick man of Asia, China, got its first power plants and its first paved roads and its first medical program with the barefoot doctors. And in addition to the communists, the wave of Marxist governments aligned with the Soviet Union that were all rapidly industrializing with 5-year economic plans and electrifying and wiping out illiteracy and all of that, you also had a layer of militaristic authoritarian regimes that were aligned with the United States. And those regimes were not communist, and those regimes were often very murderous and genocidal. In Latin America, those regimes tended to murder indigenous people pretty ruthlessly. And these regimes all crushed communists and, disappeared students. They did a lot of ruthless stuff. But they also industrialized, and in order to hold, the only way people would tolerate very authoritarian military regimes was they had to deliver the goods. The Shah of Iran was a ruthless, brutal dictator. But in 1960, the Kennedy administration kind of twisted his arm and forced him to have the White Revolution and to, build railroads in Iran and redistribute land. And they did that in the hopes of stabilizing Iran to prevent a communist revolution. The White Revolution of Iran that came from above, that came from the dictator Shah, was largely seen as a mechanism for preventing a red revolution. The military dictator Park Chung-hee of South Korea, really absolutely ruthless person, had concentration camps where homeless children were worked to death, disappeared students for their leftist activism. But he also built a state-run steel industry, POSCO. He built Samsung, the car, the electronics manufacturer. He built Hyundai, the car manufacturer. And with the military and with the government, he created corporations that raised people up out of poverty. And that was something the United States kind of pressured him to do to stabilize South Korea. So they didn't have a communist revolution. Prior to him, they'd had the military dictator Syngman Rhee. And Syngman Rhee murdered his people and was pretty ruthless. And the people overthrew him. And, underground communist cells and college students and farmers went out and brought down Syngman Rhee and had a democratic revolution in the 1950s. And there was a great fear on the part of the United States that, that if things in South Korea didn't improve, they might go all the way and join with North Korea and become a communist, Marxist country. So the United States worked with Japan, and they oversaw a rapid increase to stabilize South Korea. And that these military Bonapartist regimes, which were right wing, mind you, very anti-communist, right? Back then in the Cold War, you defined left wing and right wing by how close to the communists were. Nobody was further from the communists than Park Chung-hee. Nobody was further from the communists than the Shah of Iran. But those guys used the government to raise up productive forces because that was the way of preventing communist revolution. While they ruthlessly suppressed the communists, they also handed out the goods. And in Latin America, these dictatorships would, they would hand out jobs. The military would own factories, and the military would have very high salaries. There'd be a whole layer of people at the top of the military who got really high salaries and got contracts to have military factories. And it was, these regimes were not free market regimes by any means. There was a huge amount of state control, and that was to bring stability. So the post-World War II economic expansion of the 1950s, 60s, and early 70s, that was a time in which there was almost no free market economics anywhere in the world. During that time, in the West, it was the heyday of the welfare state. And the labor movement was stronger than ever before. Industrial unions and cheap, subsidized college education and free college, free healthcare in Europe. In the third world, it was the rise of communist governments and the rise of anti-communist military states that engaged in militaristic control over the economy. No one was talking about free markets. So anyone who tells you that only the free market can create economic growth, I mean, the economic growth was created by the mass destruction of the post-World War II, World War II, but there was a huge amount of economic growth in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and nobody was practicing free markets. And what the free market ideology that we have now, it says that the government must stay out of the economy, that capitalism is magic and always works. No one started implementing those policies until the 1970s. Now, the Montpellier Society existed, and the Austrian school economists, and there were organizations in the 1950s and 60s, like the John Birch Society and others, that advocated these kind of policies, but they weren't being implemented. It wasn't really until the 70s, when the post-World War II economic expansion came to an end. It wasn't until then that we started to see free market policies be implemented. And free market policies were considered right-wing because they were less communist. Communists wanted a state-controlled economy. Communists aligned with labor unions. Communists fought for a bigger welfare state. And so to be right-wing was to be against the communists. So right-wingers were advocates of free market policies, except for the various military dictatorships and right-wing governments that had heavy state control over the economy amid brutal repression and anti-communist ideology being preached. So these things don't quite make sense. And let me just throw this out there, right? Let me just throw this out there. This notion that that the right wing is always the main danger, And if someone's left wing, they're always better. Was that what the Communist International believed? Is that what the Soviet Union always believed? No. 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 That's what they believed after World War II. That's not what they believed during the 1930s, not in the early 1930s. In the early 1930s, the Communist International, so the Communist International was the world collection of communist parties from around the world. And they had a number of congresses. And they hammered out their political beliefs at those congresses. And the Sixth World Congress of 1928 was definitive. It happened in 1928. They had the Sixth World Congress where they declared class against class. That was the Congress where Trotsky was repudiated and Bukharin was repudiated. Trotsky was called the left opposition. Bukharin was called the right opposition. And Stalin prevailed. And Stalin implemented the policies that were known as the policies of class against class, or the third period. Stalin and his theoreticians argued that since World War I, the world economy had gone through three periods. Immediately after World War I, there was the Russian Revolution, there were uprisings in Hungary, there was an uprising in Germany. So the first period had been mass revolts and upheaval after World War I. But then, after the mass revolts and upheaval, you had the Roaring Twenties, because there'd been so much destruction in World War I. You had a period of capitalist stabilization. But then Stalin saw the Great Depression coming. The Great Depression was already a reality in Germany and other places. And so he argued in 1928 that they were entering the third period, which would be the collapse of capitalism in the West and the industrialization of the USSR. And so the USSR launched 5-year economic plans to rapidly industrialize. And the economy of the Western countries started crashing, and so communists started leading protests of unemployed, desperately poor unemployed people. They started trying to organize unions among workers that were not in unions, and they started trying to organize unions that were explicitly led by communists. And during the third period, starting with the Sixth World Congress, the communist parties of the world argued that the main danger was the left wing. I am not making that up. That was the policy. They felt that the left wing was the main danger. Social democrats and anti-communist leftists were the main danger. They called them social fascists. And in Germany, the communists focused on fighting the Social Democrats. And in America, the Communist Party focused on fighting against and exposing the American Federation of Labor, the Reformist Labor Union, and the Socialist Party. And at the same time, Stalin wrote about captains of industry. This is very interesting, about how industrial capitalists believed in economic growth. And they could be allies of the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union also believed in economic growth. And Stalin argued that American methods would be useful. And Henry Ford was hired to go and build car factories in the Soviet Union. And General Electric, the Morgans, were hired to help the Soviet Union build their power plants. And they said that industrialists who were right-wing were progressive and could be friends of the USSR, and the Social Democrats were the main enemy. They were the main barrier. They were the roadblock to revolution. That was the policy of the Communist International until the Seventh World Congress. 1935, they had the Seventh World Congress. And at the Seventh World Congress, they changed the policy. And the policy became that the focus should be on opposing fascism. And many of these captains of industry, like Henry Ford, like Henry Morgan, had become supporters of Hitler. Meanwhile, the Social Democrats were also against fascism. So they flipped. And instead of opposing the Social Democrats and wanting to be friends with the industrial capitalists and the right-wing captains of industry, they flipped. They flipped. And they became friends with the Social Democrats, and they opposed the right-wing industrialists and captains of industry. And they were right in both instances. It was correct in the early 1930s to focus on opposing the left wing, and it was correct in the late 1930s to focus on opposing the fascist right wing. It's just a matter of circumstance. After World War II, the Cold War began, and the Soviet Union wanted to have leaders in Western countries who would make a deal with them. And the more left-wing you were, the more potentially friendly to the Soviet Union you were. So it became kind of the policy that, that communists aligned with more left-wing leaders and opposed more right-wing ones. But not always. For example, Spain had a far-right dictatorship, a fascist government led by Franco. Francisco Franco was the fascist dictator of Spain. He was an ally of Hitler. He had toppled the Spanish Republic. Communists from all over the world had gone to Spain to fight against Franco in the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939. Franco was in power in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And who was good friends with Franco? Fidel Castro. That's right. Fidel Castro and Francisco Franco were good friends. And in fact, the United States was far more hostile to Fidel Castro than Franco was. Britain was far more hostile to Fidel Castro than Franco was. It doesn't make any sense, but Franco was this far-right authoritarian dictator, but he was far friendlier to the communist government of Cuba than any of the open, free, liberal Western capitalist countries were. That doesn't make any sense. Meanwhile, North Korea had very good relations with Franco and Spain. Franco had no issue with North Korea. He got along very well with North Korea. In fact, Franco was far friendlier to North Korea than Britain, France, United States. What sense does that make? So even then, during the Cold War, it actually didn't make sense. Franco's Spain was considered to be a far-right government, but they were actually more friendly to communist governments. None of this makes any sense. None of this makes any sense. And it really just goes to show you that there's nuance in everything. If I've learned anything in my life, it's that there is no permanent tactical orientation. What's right on Tuesday might be wrong on Wednesday. And that's just how the world works. And it's funny because I've read Trotsky's writings. Leon Trotsky was a harsh critic of the Soviet Union. And one of his big critiques of the Soviet Union, he said, they zigzag. They zigzag. One day they're running this way. The next day they're running that way. They're zigging and they're zagging. They're zigging and they're zagging. William Z. Foster, the great leader of the American Communist Party, they used to say that the Z in his name stood for zigzag because he was constantly changing his policy. Well, policies change because the world changes. The world is not the same. The world is not the same. And in the early 1930s, the Social Democrats were the main danger. And then after the rise of Hitler and fascism, the far right became the main danger. And in the time of Abraham Lincoln, it was very much correct to support the Republican Party. The New York Tribune was the Republican Party newspaper of New York City. And guess who they hired to be their London correspondent? Karl Marx. All right, the editor of the New York Tribune was Horace Greeley. Horace Greeley, a great American, a really great American, who fought for the right of women to vote multiple generations before they got it. who was an advocate of the white rights of workers, who called himself a Christian socialist, was a firm abolitionist who was opposed to slavery, Horace Greeley. And Horace Greeley was the leader of the Republican Party of New York City. And Horace Greeley hired Karl Marx to be his correspondent for the New York Tribune in London. And Abraham Lincoln had a communist general in his army, August Willich. And Karl Marx organized a rally in London to oppose slavery in America. A mass rally was organized by the International Working Men's Association. And Abraham Lincoln sent a greeting, a message, a direct letter to the Marxist rally, the International Working Men's Association's rally in New York City. And, you know, what's interesting is that Abraham Lincoln was probably considered to be left-wing because Abraham Lincoln was was opposed to slavery. I guess he wasn't an abolitionist, right? But he was opposed to slavery. And his party was called the Republican Party. And the word Republican, that was the French Revolution. In 1848, in Europe, there were over 200 different armed uprisings. Almost every European country had an armed uprising in 1848. And the people doing the rebelling in Germany and France and Belgium and Britain and all kinds of places, you had uprisings. And the people doing the rebelling were called Republicans. And what were they demanding? They were demanding the creation of republics. They wanted to get rid of kings and monarchs and principalities, and they wanted a republic for a nation state. And the Republican Party was the American political party that was inspired by the Republican uprisings in Europe. So the Republican Party was considered a left-wing political party in the 1800s. And it was absolutely correct to support the Republican Party in 1860, 1864. That was the right position. I guess the point that I'm making, right, in What Is to Be Done by Vladimir Lenin, he frequently repeats the phrase that if the situation changes in 24 hours, the tactics must also change in 24 hours. There's no law. There's no permanent tactical orientation. The point is to win. The point is to actually change the world. And if changing the world today means you support a left-wing candidate, fine. If changing the world today means supporting a right-wing candidate, fine. If changing the world today means supporting no candidate, fine. There's no law that says thou shalt always be left-wing and thou shalt always be right. What does it mean? What does it mean? What does it even mean anymore? Right? Feminism is generally considered to be a left-wing movement. Right? However, the USA goes around invading countries nowadays, supposedly to liberate the women. Is the U.S. military a left-wing organization that goes around? I guess it is. And also, some of the primary opponents of the transgender movement are feminists. They're not doing it in the name of religion. They're not doing it in the name of tradition. They're doing it in the name of feminism. So are feminists who are protesting and organizing, often with conservatives and Republicans, against the trans movement, are they right-wing? I mean, they believe in feminism. Feminism is considered to be a left-wing ideology, and they're motivated by feminism. So are they left-wing? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. That's what I'm telling you. You can't judge people by their label. Labels don't mean anything. Labels do not mean anything. I've said this over and over again. There are communists on every side of every issue nowadays. There are communists that are pro-trans. There are communists that are anti-trans. There are communists that support Ukraine. There are communists that support Russia. There are communists that support Israel. There are communists that support the Palestinians. There are communists that are on every side of every issue. So if you just say, I'm a communist, what does that mean? It might mean you support Ukraine, might mean you support Russia, might mean you support the Palestinians, but if you're in the U.S. Socialist Workers Party, it means you support Israel. It might mean that it might mean that you support gun control and want to take away guns. It might mean that you are an advocate of the right to bear arms. There are communists on every side of every issue. So pointing at people and saying, "Oh, we got to oppose communism," which ones? It doesn't mean anything. Christianity. There are Christians that have rainbow flags at their churches. There are Christians that bus their congregants to Black Lives Matter rallies. There are also Christians who picket abortion clinics. There are Christians who vehemently support Israel, and there are Christians like Pastor Steven Anderson in Arizona that vehemently oppose Israel. So, when you say, well, I'm a Christian, what does that mean? I mean, it probably means that you draw at least something from the Bible, probably means that you follow the teachings of Jesus Christ. But other than that, when it comes to political issues, it could put you on a wide variety of sides of all different issues. Muslims, there were a lot of Muslims who voted for Trump in the last election. There were a lot of Muslims who voted for Jill Stein, and there were a lot of Muslims who voted for Kamala Harris. Muslims tend to support the Palestinians because they're Muslim. Not always. There are actually Muslims in Azerbaijan that support Israel. I don't know how that works, but there are some sects of Muslims in Azerbaijan that say they support Israel. So, what does that mean? What's the Muslim position? Well, it depends which Muslim you talk to. Right? These labels don't mean anything. Right? They let me put it this way. It's not that they don't mean anything. These labels mean that you draw wisdom from a certain well, right? If you're a Marxist or a communist, you draw wisdom from Karl Marx, you draw wisdom from Lenin, you draw wisdom from that well. But what you do with that wisdom can mean a variety of different things. If you're a Christian, that means you draw wisdom from the Bible, you draw wisdom from the Christian tradition. But what you do with that wisdom could be very different. If you're a Muslim, that means you draw wisdom from the Quran, practice the 5 pillars of Islam. But what that means to you and how you implemented that in your life and how that explains the world, you could be very different. And blanket statements, which I hear frequently, right? Well, Muslims think this, not all of them. Christians think this, not all of them. Communists think this, not all of them. It's a way to not listen to somebody. Right? And basically, it's if I don't agree with you, and you say you're a communist, you go, oh, he's a communist, and I don't have to listen to anything you said. If I don't agree with you, and I can identify you as a Christian, I say, oh, he's a Christian, and I just slap the label of Christian on you, I don't have to listen to anything you say. You're a Muslim, and I don't agree with you, I can just slap the label of Muslim on you. Oh, he's a Muslim. And by doing that, you don't have to actually engage what the person says. It gives the person who disagrees with you a way of not listening to you. They can say, I already know what he believes because he's this. Well, actually, you don't, because there are so many different interpretations of the label. You actually don't know what he believes. But it's a way to silence the person. And one thing that I've repeatedly brought up is that in the lead up to the Second World War, every ideology and every movement got cut down the middle. And this is something that, again, we're not doing kindergarten stuff here. This is not, we're doing, this is advanced politics here. In the lead up to World War II in Britain, there was an ultra patriotic movement of conservative, traditional British men who lived together, men who pledged to live and die for the Great Britain, men who exercised together, men who did not drink alcohol, men who pledged to never have sex before they got married. And that movement was called the Buff, the British Union of Fascists, the Black Shirts. And they lived together. They're single men who lived together, and they exercised together, and they didn't drink, and they didn't have sex until they were married, and they marched around with the British flag, and they said Britain first, and they were very opposed to communism, and they wanted to get back to traditional morality and all of that, and they were called the British Union of Fascists. They were considered a right-wing group in Britain. They were led by Oswald Mosley, and they admired Hitler and Mussolini. And so, in Britain, there was another group that emerged. And it was made up of young men who lived together, who exercised together, who did not drink alcohol, who pledged to never have sex until they got married, who waved the British flag and said Britain first, and said we need to get back to traditional morality. And they marched around with British flags, and they were very conservative, and they were called the Oxford Group. And they eventually changed their name to Moral Rearmament. And they opposed Hitler. And they wanted to align with the United States and with the Soviet Union against Hitler. And if you put the two groups next to each other, you didn't listen to what they were saying, you just looked at what they did. They're all men. They don't drink. They don't have sex. They exercise. They march around with British flags. You would have said these are the exact same organizations, except one was on one side and one was on the other. And in fact, if you asked them what they were for, you didn't ask them about world politics. You didn't ask them who they were voting for. You just said, what do you believe in? They would have probably said roughly the same thing. We think Britain needs to get back to Christianity. Britain, we need a strong nation, and we need good moral rearmament and values, and we need physical fitness, and we need to stop drinking alcohol. And, they looked exactly the same, but they were on opposite sides. They voted for different candidates in the elections, and they were on opposite sides of World War II. And when World War II broke out, the leader of the British Union of Fascists was thrown in prison. And the leader of Moral Rearmament, the Oxford Group, got a radio show where he preached or encouraged people to fight in the war. Well, that goes to show you that not everything is about ideology, is it? But I will continue. At that time in the United States, Black people in the South lived under Jim Crow segregation. They couldn't vote. They didn't have any rights. Many Black people moved to urban centers in the United States. They moved to Detroit. They moved to Cleveland. They moved to New York City. Harlem was considered to be the capital of Black America. 125th Street in Harlem is considered the capital of Black America. That's where the Apollo Theater is located. That's, where the Adam Clayton Powell office building is. It's a very important street. And in Harlem, Black people who felt alienated from the American system, felt like the American government didn't care about them, felt like they needed to open Black businesses, etc. Many of them were part of the Nation of Islam. And the Nation of Islam was a religion that had started in Detroit. It was originally started by a guy who they called Master Farad. Eventually, it was, passed on to a guy they called the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. It was a religion that mixed the teachings of the Bible and the teachings of the Quran with Black nationalism and specific racial theories about the role of Black people in history. And it was a very powerful religious movement. And they were all over Harlem, and they started Black-owned businesses, and they encouraged Black people to identify as a separate nationality, etc. And the Nation of Islam felt that the rise of Japan in Asia was a good thing because it was a non-white empire, right? That Japan was rising to become an imperialist colonizer, and they thought that was a good sign because that showed that the non-white people, the people of color of the world, could build their own empires. They were very enthusiastic about Japan in the Second World War. However, in Harlem, among Black people who felt that they were oppressed by the American system, who wanted to have Black-owned businesses and felt alienated from the American system, there was another movement. And it was led by Father Divine. And Father Divine was a black man from the South who said he was the second coming of Jesus. And he built a mass movement that opened all kinds of black-owned businesses. He had a list of demands on the American system to reform and improve things. And he was very opposed to Japan. And he was very opposed to Hitler. And he organized big demonstrations, hands off Ethiopia, when Italy invaded Ethiopia. And he was a good friend of the Communist Party, and he supported Roosevelt. Two movements in Harlem among black people that felt alienated by the American system, that did roughly the same thing, start black-owned businesses, a religion that, thought they were in a messianic age. But one was on one side of World War II. The other was on the other side. And then that brings me to communism. At this point, communism was led by the Communist International. Stalin was kind of the leader of the international communist movement. But there was another guy who didn't agree with Stalin. His name was Trotsky. Trotsky fled the Soviet Union, was exiled, kicked out of the country, moved to Turkey, and then to France, and then to Mexico. And Trotsky said that he was the true interpreter of Lenin, and that that the Russian Revolution had been good, but Stalin had distorted the whole thing, and he was the true inheritor of the Russian Revolution. And the Communist International was the third international. The first international had been started by Marx. The second international was the Social Democrats. And the third international, or the Communist International, had been started by Stalin. So Trotsky launched the fourth international. And Stalin said it was necessary to align with Roosevelt to build a united front against Hitler, a popular front against Hitler. And Trotsky said, oh no, we will never align with imperialists. It's the workers and the bosses. Stalin said it was necessary for the USA and Britain and France and the Soviet Union to come together to defeat Hitler. Trotsky said, plague on both your houses. The workers have no interest in this fight one way or another. But if you looked at what the Trotskyites did, and if you look at what the Communist Party did in America, they did roughly the same thing. They built labor unions. They organized strikes and demonstrations. They read the same books, Marx and Lenin. They studied the same books. They advocated the same thing. If you talk to them, they wanted eventually to have a society where the banks, factories, and industries were organized by the workers. But the communists supported Roosevelt. And the Trotskyites, they were in the labor unions, but they pushed the labor unions to support Republicans who opposed Roosevelt. All right? John L. Lewis, the leader of the miners' union, he didn't want to agree to a wartime strike pledge. And so the Trotskyites went and helped John L. Lewis organize a miners' strike during World War II. The Communist Party said that they had to do everything for victory, and the strike was disrupting the war effort. The Trotskyites said, oh no, workers have no say in this fight. Hitler's not our enemy. They were on opposite sides in World War II. And in fact, Trotsky was convicted in absentia of being an agent of Adolf Hitler. The Moscow trials, very famous, 1937. Bukharin, Zinoviev confessed to having been in a conspiracy with Trotsky. Generally that is dismissed as just a fabrication by Stalin, but who knows? I mean, Grover Furr, who I respect, has done a huge amount of research, and he has found evidence showing that Trotsky at least tried to contact Bukharin and Zinoviev and was in touch with them to at least some degree or other. So there was that. And who knows? In Spain, Stalin and the communists were supporting the Spanish Republic. And Trotsky was supporting a group called the POUM, P-O-U-M, the Workers' Party of Spain. And it's been proven that the POUM was being funded by Franco. because the POUM was trying to disrupt the fight against the fascists. The communists wanted to do everything to defend the Spanish Republic from Franco, but the POUM was organizing strikes and demonstrations and said that, you know, that the fight was actually against the capitalists of Spain, whether they're fascist or not. And it's later been proven that the Trotskyites of Spain, they were the fifth column, right? Franco, outside of the city of Barcelona, he said, I have 4 columns outside the city, but inside the city, I have the 5th column. And the 5th column referred to the Trotskyites and the anarchists who were inside of Barcelona disrupting the Spanish Republic and saying that the workers of Spain should fight the capitalists and that there should be no unity. So what I'm telling you, I guess I just used this whole opening remark here to explain to you that left and right don't mean anything, and that who you support in any election or in any political situation is based on the circumstances at the time, not based on any eternal law. Sometimes you might support the right wing, sometimes you might support the left wing, and sometimes left wing means one thing, and sometimes right wing means something else. There are no eternal laws in politics. Everything is changing. That's my point. And I hope that I've spent the last hour making that point in a way that you can understand and getting you to think the way I think. Our goal is to build a government of action that fights for working families and break this country out of imperialism. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. That's what I'm for, and that is what I advocate. And what tactic or method we utilize in order to achieve that aim and who we align with is based on how we best can achieve that aim, not any moralistic or eternal law. Hey friends, how you doing today? I'm letting you know, the Center for Political Innovation, we are about to do, on July 12th, the biggest event that we have ever done. It will be our national gathering in Chicago on July 12th. And it's going to be really, really special. We are talking with a number of important anti-imperialist voices, a lot of different communities. There's going to be musical performances, dance performances, there's going to be great speeches, and it's going to be a whole day gathering dedicated to anti-imperialism. I am committed, and CPI has always been committed to building an in real life network of people. And we carry out real operations. We were at the inauguration of Trump with our Trump and Kim banner saying only peace can make America great again. We were on the streets of Chicago at the Democratic National Convention with a book exposing what Kamala Harris and who she really is and what she's really about, and it was really, really important. We have 1,000 copies of our book about the Houthis that are being distributed with the poster of the convention on the back to people who would never go looking for this. We are putting door hanger flyers on doors of people, again, that would never go looking for this. We're not performing and trying to make ourselves feel good. We're actually trying to build a network of people that can be anti-imperialists in America. And it's not easy to do. It's very difficult in these times to build a real in-life organization. People have their issues. We live in a very strange time, but we have to do it. And we are committed to continuing this project. This video is basically me telling you we need your support. In order to pull off our convention that includes our 7-day program for our members around the country to come to Chicago, includes our huge convention on July 12th, where we're gonna fill up the Midwest Convention Center, in order to have an effective national planning meeting and gathering in Chicago the day after on July 13th. In order to do what we need to do, we need to fill up that auditorium and we need money. And there's really no way around that. We need you to donate to the Center for Political Innovation. We have set up a GoFundMe, and a lot of people have already contributed. We already raised a couple $1,000, but it's not enough. In order to really pull off our July activities and really have a win for anti-imperialism, we need your support. We need you to go to the GoFundMe right now and donate $5 or $20. We need you to go to the donate button on the CPI website and send us $100 or $50. whatever you can do. If we're gonna do what we need to do in July and build the organization and have the mega anti-imperialist rally that needs to happen on July 12th and solidify the network that we're building to continue to carry out the great operations that we do, we need you to help us out. Every cent that we raise goes into building this group. I'm lucky I have a paycheck with everything that's going on. I'm surviving, and I have consistently put a huge amount of the money that I have, my own resources, my own funds, into CPI because I believe in it, because it needs to happen, because this organization is necessary. I'm looking at what I've got and my own resources and my own bills and all of that, and I'm looking at what's already been paid for, and it's not enough. I mean, it's just not enough. I can't just pay for everything myself. We have membership dues and other things, but we need a special gift. We need a special gift to make July happen. We need you to give us a special contribution so that we can make sure the July events go smoothly, that the housing for the people coming in out of town is covered, that the speakers that are being flown in, their airfare is properly covered. We need you to make a special one-time gift to make this July gathering, this anti-imperialist summit that we are organizing. We need you to help us make it happen and help us make it a success. Small gift, big gift, whatever you can do. We need you to help us with it. But you know what? I'll just say this. If it's a matter of send us a gift or come, we'd rather you come. We'd rather you be there. It's much more important that you be there on July 12th. If you can't afford to give us a gift, but you can afford to come to town, if there's one event that you come to this year, make it July 12th. CPI, Center for Political Innovation, we're doing something that nobody else is doing, and we're doing it right. We're not doing it in a way that we're trying to win the internet. We're not doing it in a way that we're trying to make ourselves feel special or act like we're cool. We're building what needs to be built. We are building the real connections. And if you can understand why what we're doing is so important, if you can understand why anti-imperialism is the future, but we have to break out of the narrow niche circles and internet culture and get to the masses of people with real outreach. If you can understand that, please give us a gift. We're trying to build an actual movement to win new people to anti-imperialism and continue to carry out operations to change the conversation in America, so that we have a country where there's a mass movement demanding justice for working families and an end to these wars, that we're saying no to World War III, we're saying no to the emerging low-wage police state. That's what we urgently need. So if you can help us in any way, send us a gift. If you can be there on July 12th, be there. This is the biggest endeavor CPI has ever done, and it's going to lead to even bigger things. We don't back down. We don't go away. If we were going to back down, we would have done it a long time ago. And if we were one of their plants or one of these fake anti-imperialists, they would be making it a lot easier for us. We have been facing a lot of challenges, but we continue to achieve great victories. So we need your support. Please send us a contribution. Please be there on July 12th at the Midwest Convention Center in the Chicago area. It's right near the O'Hare Airport. It's going to be awesome. We need you there. Thank you.